All right, this is lecture 12. In this lecture, mainly we're going to talk about what we call in physics geometrical optics. Essentially, we're going to treat light as kind of like something that travel in a straight line. That's not 100% correct because we all know that light is electromagnetic wave. And actually, there's no wave that can travel in a straight line unless the medium is configured to be a straight line, like a, a string or an air column. So you cannot go kind of like sideways. But for light, actually it can go sideways. There's nothing really to prevent it from spreading. But that's kind of like the thing we're gonna ignore for this lecture. We're gonna treat light to be something that just go in a straight line, okay? And we're gonna talk about a few, you know, optical elements that we use in daily life to shape how we see things. For example, things might be too small. We can use, lenses to help with us the object which is far away, we can see it better. Or mirrors, where you can use curved mirror to help seeing behind the corner. So that's gonna prevent a lot of, traffic accident. And we're gonna look at one equation which applies for both lenses and mirrors, okay? And we're gonna see how we use this equation. Okay, so that's kind of like the theme today. We're gonna be drawing a lot of pictures today, right? So um, that's what we're gonna cover in today's lecture. Before we start talking about today's topic, let's review a little bit what we talked about last time. So last time we talked about Snell's law, and Snell's law is actually the basis of everything we're gonna talk about today. What is Snell's law again? Snell's law tells you how light changes direction when it goes from one type of medium to a different type of medium. So the usual situation that we studied last time is when you have like an interface between two media, for example, air, where you characterize air using the index of refraction, and it's very close to 1, right? If you remember the index of refraction of air. It's a little bit larger than 1, but if you don't care too much about the precision, 1 is good enough. And then let's say we have glass, okay, and let's call it N2, and glass is about 1.5. And what we learned last time is that if we have light striking the interface between those two media, you're gonna have the trajectory of light changes from what it used to be, right? So for example, you have light going in a straight line like this, right? So if on the other side it's also air, then light will just go in a straight line. There's no change in the direction at all. But now we replace air on the other side with glass, right, which has different index of refraction than air. So different index of refraction means that the velocity of light wave is going to be different, right? 1.5 is going to be slower than 1. And because of that, the direction of light propagation going to change. In this case, it's going to bend towards the center line, which we call normal line, if you remember, right? Something like this, okay? And we have this angle theta, and we say it to be theta I, standing for incident angle, and then this one we call it theta t, standing for transmitted angle, right? And Snell's law. Snell's law says that n1 sine of theta I equal to n2 sine of theta t. Okay, so Snell's law relates this angle with this angle, right? And you can see that if N2 and N1 are different, then these two angles are going to be different also. Okay, and one interesting thing that can happen we saw last time is what we call total internal reflection, TIR. Okay, total internal reflection. That's for the case when you go from high index of refraction to low index of refraction, right? And what's gonna happen is that because light gonna bend away from the center line when you have this, it can happen that light gonna bend away such that the transmitted angle is gonna be 90 degrees, like this. And this happens at what we call the critical angle theta c, right? So if you are at critical angle or larger than critical angle, then the only thing gonna happen at this interface is 100% reflection, because there's no light gonna go through the other side. Okay, so these two angles is gonna be the same. Incident angle, which is the critical angle in this case, gonna be equal to the reflected angle. Okay, so this is what we call total internal reflection. So all the light gonna get reflected, and this is very useful because we use this in sending data through an optical fiber. Nowadays, the internet signal that we use, and especially in this time, right? We use a lot of internet, and the signal is transmitted through an optical fiber instead of just a regular, copper wire. There's still some copper wire used in, like some region, but the performance is a lot worse than an optical fiber, which essentially pipe to transfer light from one place to another place, right? And the thing is that we know that light travel in a straight line, right? So how can we kind of guide the light to go around the corner and following the shape of the light tube? For example, in this case, is a tube that looks like this. So we use total internal reflection to guide the light inside this optical fiber. So remember that if you have the incident angle to be large enough, then all the light gonna get reflected because you are beyond the critical angle. And you can see that's something that we are trying to have here, right? So in an optical fiber, you're gonna have two different regions: the outer region, which is like this region, and the inner region, which is the core here, right? So if you make it such that the index of refraction of the core, and this is technical term is called the cladding, which is just a fancy name for like things surrounding the core, right? So if we choose to make it such that the index of the core is larger than the index of the cladding, right? So this satisfies the condition for total internal reflection because you're trying to go from high index to low index, right? So light gonna be inside the core, which is high index, and it's trying to go to the outside, the cladding, which is lower index, right? So if you make it such that the light hitting the surface of the core has the incident angle larger than the critical angle, then all the light gonna bounce within the core. It's not gonna leave the core ever. So this is how we use this TIR, total internal reflection, to guide light through this kind of light pipe, if you may. So it's kind of like a pipe or a tube that light gonna stay within the tube, right? But actually what's happening is just you have a lot of reflection at the boundary, and because every reflection is total internal reflection, so no light gonna leak away from the core. And it can be as long as you want, a few kilometers, hundreds of kilometers. Actually, we have optical fiber that goes from one continent to the other continent. And for that large distance, the light is still good enough to appear on the other side, right? So you can send the signal here, and then you can receive the signal here. And you can essentially blink the light, okay? And how you blink depends on what kind of data you are transmitting. And light is traveling at a very high speed, right? So that's why we can have a really high throughput of the data through this kind of optical fiber. And that's the basis of telecommunication that we have nowadays. Okay, so this is a very important application of the thing we call total internal reflection here. All right. So that's what we talked about last time. Today we're going to talk about a different application of Snell's law, which is in terms of constructing lenses mainly. But before we talk about lens, we probably need to talk about mirror first. And even before we talk about like how mirrors gonna change the way we see, it's probably better if we step back and think about actually how we see stuff, like how vision works. So I think maybe I'll go to this slide. So we see because of the way one particular organ work in our body, which is the eyes, right? So we have a pair of eyes, so you have like one on the right hand side and one on the left hand side. But even if you are left with just one eye, you can still see, right? So it's probably sufficient just talk about one single eye. And an eye is a spherical object that looks something like this, okay? And an eye is kind of like, a biological camera in the sense that there's an opening in front of the eyes, and that's what we call an iris, right? So that's where light enter the eyes. An iris here. And then at the back of the eyes here, that's the the back side of the eye, which is the side that you cannot see from outside, right? It's within your eyes. That's where you have a lot of cells that act like a photoreceptors, and that's what we call retina cell. And some of you probably have studied biology, and like there's like the rod cells and then cone cells, and different type of cell are sensitive to different kind of light, and how we see colors, but like some of that. But the important thing is that this one acts kind of similar as like a photographic film, right? So if light hit retina, then our brain will translate the signal from the cell, and then it translates to the image that we see. Okay, so this is an eye, and let's say we have like a tree here, right? And the reason why we see this tree, or our brain can like process the signal from the retina that okay, we are seeing a tree here. What's really happening here? In order to see the tree, you have to see every part of the tree, and that's the same for every object, right? So for this tree, you have to see the top of the tree, the leaf here, the kind of like the trunk here, the root here. So every single point that you are seeing acts like a light source. Light source means it's the point that gives it out light. Okay, and we see because there's sunlight, and light hit the tree, and the tree reflect out the light. So what we see is the light reflected off an object. But nonetheless, let's talk about this particular point on the tree. Okay, so it's going to give out light in every direction in a straight line. And there's going to be a few light direction that enter the eye. So there will be some light going to go into the eyes like this. And then an iris here contains a biological lens. We're going to talk about lens in a few moments. But its task is to converge the light so that this point here, which is from the top of the tree, give out light like this. And the lens going to converge the light onto the same point on the retina. Okay, so we are talking just about this particular point of the tree. Okay, this point giving out light in every direction, and these two particular pair, which is only two of like millions of light ray coming out from the top of the tree. The role of the lens at the iris here is to converge these two light so that this point here on the tree is projected onto a single point on the retina screen, retina cell. So let me label the top of the tree to be point A. So the point A get projected onto the eye to be point A here. And we're going to repeat the same thing for every single point on the tree. But that's going to take a long time, right? So I just pick a few points. Let's say I pick the middle of the tree like here. Let's call it point B. Point B also going to give out light in every direction. And there will be some light, again, that's going to enter the eyes like this in a straight line, something like this. Okay, and then the iris again, or the lens at the iris, will converge this pair into another point on the retina. So point B here is projected onto point B on the retina screen here. And then lastly, let's just pick the trunk, which is the lowest point of the tree. So let's say we pick this particular point, point C here. Okay, so point C, again, we also give out light in every direction. So it's going to have light coming out this way, coming this way. And then the lens will, again, project the light onto the retina like that. So the point C is projected onto the retina like that. So you can imagine that if we really repeat this, procedure for every point on the tree, then the image of the whole tree is projected onto the retina. It's going to be upside down. That's fine because our brains know that it's upside down, so the brains kind of flip it up for us. Okay, so we don't need to, see upside down, and that's kind of like how evolution got us to this point. Okay, but basically that's how we see stuff. Now, the thing is that in terms of our eyes, it only cares about like the light entering the eyes and then projecting the light onto the retina cell. So that means you can actually fool the eye by having some kind of optical instrument to make it such that it looks like the object is somewhere, but it's not actually there. And this is demonstrated in the next picture here. This is what we have in terms of plane mirror. So plane mirror is just flat mirror. It's nothing too special. Okay, and a plane mirror is the surface that only reflects light, and it's gonna reflect the light according to one of the law that we saw last time, which is incident angle equal to the reflected angle. So what we have here is we have a tree here, and we have our eye here. Our eye is looking that way. So you might be, you might know from your experience that you're gonna see object as if it's actually inside the mirror. For example, in this case, we use the mirror, the plane mirror, to reflect the tree image. So we're gonna see the image of the tree actually behind the mirror. That's not really happening, in real life, right? Because like inside the mirror, it cannot be anything, right? Because it's just a mirror. But the way that light reflected, so point P here, again, light is going out in every direction. There will be some light that hits the mirror, get reflected, and then it get reflected such that it's entering the iris of the eye. And that bunch of light get converged and then projected onto the retina the way that I drew in the diagram above, right? But then since the eye doesn't really know where the light actually comes from, it sees the image here. The only thing it can think of is as if the image is produced by an object here, right? Because it sees light coming in this direction, it doesn't know that it's actually coming from one reflection of the mirror, right? So it just thinks, okay, it must be coming from some object that is giving out light in a straight line, right? So this is how our brain is fooled into thinking that there's an actual object here, where in reality there's not. Okay, and again, that's because of how our perception depends on the direction of the light, and that's going to be true for every other point on the tree. For example, the trunk of the tree, which is labeled by Q here, the light coming out get reflected, enters the eyes here, right? And again, the eyes doesn't know better that it's actually coming from this reflection. So it thinks that, okay, it must be coming from something, an object, which is inside the mirror. So we see an object inside the mirror, and that's how our brain works. Okay, and it actually is not a bad thing because in this case we can fool our eyes by doing some manipulation of how the light travels, and we can get some kind of effect which is quite beneficial. For example, you can enlarge the image to make small things easier to see. Okay, and that's going to be what we talk about in the next few minutes. All right, so at this point, I just want to make sure that everyone is okay so far. If you have any question, again, you can just ask me or you can type in the chat window. Okay, so this is how we see things. All right. So the first object that we're gonna talk about is again plane mirror in a little bit more details. You can probably guess from the diagram here, due to the geometry of like this system, I'm not going to spend too much time, tracing the angle or anything, but a plane mirror has a very simple effect on the image that we see. So SP here is the distance from the object, which is our tree here, to the mirror. And SP prime is the distance from the image that the brain thinks we are seeing, right? Remember, it's not real, right? It's not really there, but we think it's there. So SP prime is the distance between the image to the mirror. And for plane mirror, SP will be equal to SP prime. Okay, so if you have an object which is 1 meter away from the plane mirror, the image will be also 1 meter away from the plane mirror, right? So altogether, you might see the object is actually roughly 2 meters away, right? So it's double the distance, right? So it's actually quite simple. But things gonna be different when we are not talking about plane mirror. We talk about curved mirror, then it's gonna be not this simple. All right, so this is kind of like a small kind of prelude to what we're gonna talk about in a few minutes. Actually, before we talk about mirrors, we're gonna talk about the lens, but it's gonna be quite, similar. Anyway, the first optical element that we're gonna talk about is what we call converging lens. Converging lens is a piece of glass shaped like this. Okay, and if you cannot imagine how it looks like, a lot of you probably have seen this kind of camera, which is called the digital SLR. And SLR stands for single lens reflected camera. So you have like a lens here. And this is called converging lens or convex lens, right? And it's usually made from glass. And the reason why it's called convex lens is because the lens is thickest at the middle of the lens. Okay, so this is made from glass, and at the middle is the thickest, right? So this is the thickest part of the lens. It's called convex lens. A better name is probably converging lens because it describes exactly what it's doing. So what does convex lens do? Well, it's hard to say, but if you talk about what does converging lens do, well, it converges the light. Right? So most of the time, I'm gonna be using this term instead of convex lens because you have to think one more step what's really happening. Okay, there are 3 important things that you need to understand in order to understand how convex lens works. And we're gonna spend most of the time in today's lecture talking about converging lens because what we learn here gonna apply to different kind of lens and mirrors also. Okay, so this is probably the most important part of today's lecture. So the first property is this. If you have parallel ray of light coming from the left hand side, okay, so this might be like light ray from a really far away object like the sun or stars or something like that. It's so far away so that you don't have any like converging or diverging effect on the light ray. So it's what we call parallel ray. Okay, so all of these are light ray traveling to the right in a straight line. If you place a converging lens in the beam path, well, what it's gonna do is to converge the light, right? So the light got bent. So instead of going straight, it's gonna get converged to a single point here. This point is called focal point. So by definition, focal point is the point where all the light converge. Okay, but it's all the light converge when the light coming from the left is a parallel ray. If the light coming from the left is not parallel ray, for example, something like this, then the lens gonna converge it to a different point. That's not what we call focal point. Okay, we're gonna see that in a few moments. So by definition, again, light ray coming from the left in parallel ray gonna get focused onto one point here, and that's what we call the focal point. The distance from this point to the lens is for focal length, and it's used in like, so the letter F stands for that thing. Okay, so F here is the distance which is called the focal length. F here. So the property of the lens is given by this single number. So when, so some of you might be, like familiar with, again, the DSLR camera or SLR camera. When you have the lens which is interchangeable, right? So how do you choose the lens? Well, first you need to choose the focal length of the lens. And usually that's enough to describe what's going to happen, right? So this number is extremely, extremely important in order to say what the lens going to do. For example, in this case, we can say it's a converging lens with a focal length of, let's say, 15 centimeters. So that means if we have parallel rays from the left-hand side, it's going to get converged to this point here, which is 15 centimeters away from the lens, like this. Okay, so that's the definition of the focal length. So the light ray can run backward. So what I mean is that instead of having the light coming in from the left in a straight parallel fashion, if you have the light source, which is a point source, exactly at the focal point, meaning that it's exactly one focal length away from the lens, the light coming out is not parallel, right? It's diverging like this. But when it hits the lens gonna converge these light into a parallel ray. So think about it. This figure B is just figure A in reverse, right? The arrow are reversed in terms of the direction. Okay, so that's what's happening here, right? So if you have the light source at the focal length away from the lens, then the light will be parallel after it leaves the lens, like this. Okay, so A and B are kind of like different side of the same coin, if you may. And the last thing is this. If the light ray enters the lens near the center of the lens and is going through the center of the lens, it's not gonna get bended in any way whatsoever. So the light going into the lens at the center of the lens will just go straight. Here is also just going straight. Here is also going straight. Right. So this is also very important. We're going to use this to draw the picture of what we call the ray diagram in a few moments. Okay, so these three things are the kind of like the main functionality of converging lens. All right, so we're going to build upon these three properties to answer this kind of question. So you're going to have this diagram which looks a little bit complicated now, but you can understand this very well soon. So the question is this. If we have an object at one particular position and we put a converging lens somewhere here, because of the way light travel and get bended by the lens, there's going to be an image projected somewhere on the right hand side. Not always, but most of the time this is what happened. We want to find what is the relation between S here, and I'm gonna be very explicit here. Instead of calling just S, I'm gonna call SO, which stands for the object distance. Okay, the object distance is just the distance from the object to the lens. And another thing is the image distance, which is SI. In this diagram, it's called S prime, but I'm gonna be, again, more explicit by saying it's SI. S sub I means the distance for the image, which is the image from the lens. Okay, so that's distance. So we have three parameters, SO, SI, and then F, which is the property of the lens. And we're gonna talk about one particular formula that relates those three parameters together. Okay, but before we do that, let's talk about the ray diagram. So in this case, I'm gonna draw some picture, and the background I'm using here is the grid background. So it's a square grid, and that's really helpful when you deal with this kind of problem about ray tracing. So if you can, I suggest that you do the same thing. Can some of you mute your microphone? Thank you very much. All right, so let's have a really simple problem here. So the problem here, so example, we have a converging lens, convex lens, with the focal length of, let's say, 20 centimeters. Okay, f equal to 20 centimeters. And then let's say we put an object, let's say a tree, which is 40 centimeters away from the lens. So that means SO is 40 centimeters, okay, 40 cm. Our task is to find the location of the image. So where is the image? So we're going to do this by first doing the ray tracing diagram first. So basically just drawing stuff. And then we're going to redo this by just using an equation. Okay? And one going to guide the other one. So if the two does not agree, then you know there's something wrong. So let's do the ray tracing first. So this is called the ray tracing diagram. Essentially, we are trying to figure out how the light ray travel in this kind of situation. All right, so I'm gonna go very slowly, so please follow carefully. So the first thing we're gonna do is we draw the optical axis. So it's the line that guides everything. And that's gonna be just a normal horizontal line, like this, okay, straight line. So everything is gonna be on this line. This is called the optical axis again. Optical axis. Okay. Next thing, we're gonna put the lens. So the lens is converging lens. So let's put it somewhere in the middle, like here. And then just to indicate everything, f is equal to 20 centimeters. Okay, so this is where we put the lens. All right, and you see like there's a grid on this paper, right? So I'm gonna use one grid equal to 10 centimeters. This is my drawing scale. Okay, you have to be very careful in terms of the scaling of the image or the diagram that you are drawing. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. Okay, so this is why I say that if you have like an iPad or something that have the grid paper, that's gonna help a lot. All right, so the lens is here. So let's put in the object. The object is 40 centimeters away from the lens. So it's gonna be 4 grid away from the lens. And usually the way we draw the object is just an arrow like this. This is my object. And it's 40 centimeters away because it's 1, 2, 3, 4 away from the lens. Okay, so this is SO equal to 40 centimeters here, right? So I'm gonna not write the unit because it's taking up too much space here. Okay, so that's my object. All right, this is our setup. Our task is to find the image. So what do we do? All right, so this is important, so pay close attention. We're gonna draw two lines. The first line is gonna be the line that go parallel to the horizontal line or the optical axis. This is the line here. Okay, so remember that this point of the object give out light in every direction. Okay, so we just pick one particular light ray that coming out from the tip of the object, and the one we pick is the one that's parallel to the optical axis. So it's the blue line here. Okay, now remember this rule. Go back a little bit. This rule, if you have the light coming in parallel to the horizontal axis, the light gonna get bent towards the focal point at the focal length. That's what we have here. So the first thing for this is parallel line. So after the lens, it's gonna get converged to the focal point. And where is that point? Well, we know that the focal length of this lens is 20 centimeters. That's 2 grid away from the lens, so that's here. So we know that this particular light ray gonna get bent towards this point here. Something like this. According to the first property of the lens that we had in the previous page. Okay, everyone's clear? Again, we pick the light ray which is parallel to the optical axis, so horizontal, lined, and through the lens it's gonna get bent towards the focal point, which is 20 centimeters in this case. So that's gonna be 2 grids away from the lens. Okay? This is the first line. The second line that we're gonna use is, going back a little bit, we're gonna use this property C here. It says that the light ray going through the center of the lens will just go straight. So I can draw the second ray from the tip of the object going through the center of the lens. It will not bend, right? Because going through the center of the lens, it just goes straight. So that means I can have the second light ray going in this direction like this. Okay? So it's gonna go in this direction like this. So you can see that the light coming out from the same point get converged and then meet again here. So we don't have to do this, but if you repeat this process for every single point of the object, you're gonna build up the image at this position here. So this is how the ray tracing diagram works. So you only need to draw 2 lines, the one parallel to the horizontal and the one going through the lens. And where those 2 lines meet, that's gonna be where your image is. Okay? And it's not gonna be super accurate because the drawing is not perfect. But it's gonna give you a very good guidance on where the image should be. So in this case, by looking at the diagram, I know that the image is here. So that's about 1 grid, 2 grid, 3 grid, 4 grids away from the lens. So I suspect that Si, which is the distance of the image from the lens, is probably going to be about 40 centimeters also, because each grid is 10 centimeters. So this is my image. Okay, something like this. Now, usually this is enough, but I'm gonna show you that if we add another ray using the second property here, it's gonna be giving you the same point. So what's the second property here? The second property is that for the light ray going through the focal point on the left to the lens, the light coming out will be parallel to the horizontal line. So that means I can pick this particular line. So the focal length is again 20 centimeters away from the lens. So it's work both ways, okay? So there's one on the right hand side and also one on the left hand side. So what I can have is, I can have the light ray coming from the tip of the object going through the focal point like this, okay? And remember that light going through the focal point will get bended so that the light coming out is parallel to the horizontal line. So the light coming out on the other side will go like this. So you can see that this light ray, which is the green one, also intersect at the same point here. Right. So it's totally fine. And again, you don't need the third one because just two lines intersecting, that should be enough for you to say like where the image is gonna be. But this is just like a nice confirmation that what we are doing here is probably correct. Okay? All right. Now this is done. Again, the ray tracing is used as a very important guideline. But if you want to really calculate where exactly the image is, because of the imperfection of the drawing, you probably need to double check with the equation. And this is what we call the lens equation. And well, it's called the lens equation, and actually just one equation. It's gonna also apply with mirror in probably after the break, okay? So it's only one equation. So this is an equation which I'm not gonna prove it for you, but it's not that difficult to prove. And to prove this, you just need Snell's law. So you just have to believe me that this equation follows directly from Snell's law. It says that 1 over f equal to 1 over the image distance or the object distance plus 1 over the image distance like this. Okay, 1 over f, which is 1 over the focal length of the lens, equal to 1 over the object distance plus 1 over the image distance. So it's a very simple equation to use because you can just substitute what you know into this equation, right? In this case, we know the focal length, so we know it's 1 over 20, and everything is in centimeters. I'm not going to write that down. So 1 over 20 equal to 1 over the object distance, which is 40, plus 1 over SI, which is what we want to solve for, right? And it's a little bit awkward equation because it's 1 over everything, right? So be careful a little bit when you do arithmetic. But other than that, it's just a simple equation to solve. And you're going to see right away that this gives you SI equal to 40 centimeters, right? So make sure you solve this one and then you get this, okay? So get used to doing, the reciprocal of the numbers. So solving this equation gives you the image distance to be 40. And that's kind of close to what we got from the ray tracing diagram, right? It should be exactly on this line on the grid, but we didn't get that. But it's close enough. Again, it's because of the imperfection of the way we draw stuff. But it's 40 close enough to what we got in the ray tracing diagram, right? So if you get this, and then you solve it to be 80 or something, then you know there's something wrong, because that has to be like way over here, which is not what we got from the ray tracing diagram. Okay, so these two methods kind of complement each other, and I suggest that, well, especially if you do this kind of problem on the exam, if you have time, just do both to see that whether the two, method agrees with each other or not, right? Because there's a very high chance that you might mess up like the equation solving here, especially later on when we talk about different cases where the focal length can be negative, the image distance can be negative or something like that. Okay, so these two things are kind of like self-checking, and it's important that you know how to do both. All right, and I'm gonna go back to this image before I take a break. So this image here is just what I drew here with way many more light rays coming out from the object. Again, you only need two of them to pinpoint where the image is gonna be, but in reality, there's gonna be tons of light ray coming out, right? And the lens gonna do the same thing. It's gonna make all light ray here converge at one particular point here. And the light ray that we use in drawing are the one highlighted by this line here, right? The one parallel get bended towards the focal point, and the other one is the one going through the center of the lens, just go straight without changing the direction, and they meet at the same point. Okay, and the third one is here. Again, not necessary, but it's the one going through the focal point, and the light afterward is parallel to the horizontal line. Right. So these three lines are the three lines that I drew here. Okay, so make sure you understand why each one behaves the way it is. Okay, so it's a good time to take a break. After the break, we're gonna look at different other cases where things might be a little bit more complicated. Okay, so I'm gonna set the timer, and we will come back in 10 minutes.